The rope was already around his neck when the drums of the Bloodhorn war horns shook the gallows platform loose from every man's certainty. But that comes later. First, there was the feast hall, and the crown resting untouched on its cushion of black fur, and Glasha Bloodhorn standing over it with her jaw set like a woman, ready to burn the whole camp down before she wore it. The great lodge of Emberfall camp had been rebuilt only weeks before, its support beams still pale and raw where the fire had eaten the old ones, and every torch inside it now guttered against canvas walls stretched tight over green pine. Long tables groaned under roasted elk and river trout and bowls of stewed mountain barley, and every clan elder, every blooded warrior, every human envoy from Windrow Hold who had ridden 3 days through the passes to witness the ceremony, sat waiting with their cups raised for the toast that would make her chieftess. Glasha did not raise hers. She stood instead, tall and broad-shouldered in fitted leather war braces that laced up the sides of her forearms, her dark green skin gleaming faintly with the oil she wore for ceremony, twin braids of black hair, threaded with iron rings falling, past a collarbone marked with old scars she had never bothered to hide. Her eyes, amber and sharp as a hawk's, swept down the length of the head table until they found it, an empty chair, a low stool of dark oak carved with a cooper's mark on its backrest, a folded leather apron laid neatly across its seat where a place setting should have been. "Sit, Chieftess," murmured old Rucknar Stonewake at her elbow, his voice pitched low so only she and the nearest warriors would hear. "The clan waits. The crown waits." "The clan can wait a little longer," Glasha said, loud enough now that every head at every table turned toward her. "I will not be crowned Chieftess of the Bloodhorn while that seat sits empty." A murmur went through the hall like wind through dry grass. One of the human envoys, a thin man in a Windrow Hold doublet, leaned toward his companion and whispered something that made the man snort into his cup. Rucknar's tusks worked as he chewed the inside of his cheek, the way he did when he was searching for patience he did not naturally possess. "It is only a chair," he said. "The cooper is a good man, but he is not clan." "Tradition does not. Tradition," Glasha said, and her voice cracked through the hall like a whip, "did not survive the night my mother died screaming in her own tent while men wearing another man's colors put torches to our children's beds. I decide what tradition means now. And I say this feast does not begin, and this crown does not touch my head until Emmett Holloway is sitting in that chair." Silence. Somewhere near the back, a warrior shifted his weight and the hide flooring creaked. "Send riders," Glasha said, already turning from the table, already reaching for the long knife at her hip as if the mere act of speaking his name had put steel back into her spine. "Send riders now. If he is not through that gate before the moon clears the ridge, there will be no coronation tonight, and every one of you can explain to the ancestors why their chieftess kept them waiting on account of love." It was the first time she had said the word aloud in front of the whole clan, and the hall went so quiet that the crackle of the torches sounded like distant thunder. To understand how a chieftess of the Bloodhorn clan came to refuse her own crown for the sake of an empty chair, one had to go back 3 seasons, to a spring morning when the passes had only just opened, and a lone traitor had come walking his mule train up the cinder road with barrels of salt lashed to its back, and no earthly idea that he was walking toward the rest of his life. Emmett Holloway had been working that road for 6 years by then, ever since his father's hands had gone too stiff with the joint-take to keep coopering barrels for the trade houses of Windrow Hold, and Emmett had taken up both the trade and the tools, learning to read the grain of oak the way some men read scripture. He hauled salt up from the lowland flats and spice from the coastal caravans that passed through Windrow twice a year, and he sold both to whoever had coin or hide or good iron to trade for it, human or otherwise. Most traders would not go within a day's ride of the orc camps beyond Cinder Ridge. Emmett went twice a season, because the Bloodhorn clan paid fair and complained less than the merchants back home, and because, If he was honest with himself in the quiet hours on the road, he had grown to prefer their company. The gate wardens at Imberfall camp knew his mule by sight before they knew his face, a stubborn gray beast he called Biscuit for reasons he had never bothered to explain to anyone, orc or human. But on that particular spring morning, the warrior standing watch at the log-end hide gate was not one he recognized, and she did not lower her spear when he raised his hand in greeting. She was, he would think later, the single most striking thing he had ever seen standing in front of a wooden gate with a weapon in her hand. Tall enough to meet his eyes without tilting her chin, built with the kind of strength that came from a life spent swinging real weight rather than lounging in a keep somewhere. She wore fitted leather war braces over a sleeveless jerkin that laced snugly up her ribs, dark green skin catching the morning light, twin braids swinging loose as she planted her spear butt first in the dirt between them. "You are late," she said. "The last cooper who worked this road came before the frost, not after it." "That cooper was my father," Emmett said, working to keep his voice even because there was something about the flat gold of her stare that made his tongue feel 2 sizes too large. "He does not travel the passes anymore. I am Emmett Holloway. I have salt, dried spice from the coast, and good iron nails if your smiths have need of them." "And a mule with a ridiculous name," the orc woman said, and for one unguarded moment something that might have been amusement flickered across her mouth before she smothered it. "I heard you call it Biscuit at the bottom of the ridge. A mule should have a strong name, a war name." "He is not a war mule," Emmett said. "He is a salt mule. Salt mules get to have soft names. Everything in these mountains should have a strong name," she said, "or the mountains eat it." "Then I hope you will forgive me for keeping him soft," Emmett said, "since he is the only one of us with any sense to be afraid of you." That had earned him a longer look than he expected, one that traveled from his dust-caked boots to the salt-stained collar of his shirt and back up to his face, slow and assessing, the way a woman might look at a blade she was deciding whether to buy. Then she had laughed, a short, surprised bark of sound, and stepped aside from the gate. "I am Glasha Bloodhorn," she said, "daughter of Vashka. You will trade with me today, Cooper, since my mother is occupied with the Eastern envoys, and I intend to see whether you are worth the trouble of remembering your name." He had been worth the trouble, apparently, because by the time the sun dropped behind Cinder Ridge that evening, Glasha Bloodhorn had haggled him down on the spice and up on the iron nails with a ruthlessness that left him both irritated and, humiliatingly, a little breathless, and she had told him, without any softness at all in her voice, that he could return in a month's time if he wished to keep his customers among her people. He returned in a month's time, and the month after that. And every month the passes allowed, through that whole first summer, until the guards at the gate stopped bothering to announce him and simply waved Biscuit through, because everyone in Imberfall camp had noticed by then that the Chieftess's daughter met the salt trader at the gate herself more often than any position of rank required. Their arguments over price became something both of them looked forward to more than either would admit. She called him stubborn as stone and twice as slow to warm. He called her sharper than her own knives and twice as likely to draw blood over a copper coin. Once, in the heat of a haggling match over a barrel of pepper from the southern coast, she had grabbed the front of his shirt to yank him closer and hiss a counteroffer directly into his face, and he had made the fatal mistake of laughing at her. And for one long, charged breath, neither of them had moved, her fist still closed in his collar, both of them close enough that he could feel the warmth coming off her skin and see the flecks of darker gold buried in her eyes. She had let go so fast it was as though she had been burned, and neither of them had spoken of it, though the price of the pepper had somehow ended up entirely in Emmett's favor that day, and he suspected it had nothing to do with his negotiating skill. The stolen kiss, when it finally came, happened in autumn, in the low light of the storage tent where Emmett was inspecting the seams of a cask he had made the winter before, checking it for the slow weep of moisture that meant the wood had shrunk. Glasha had come looking for him under the excuse of a dispute about the last delivery's weight, and had ended up simply standing too close, watching his hands work the hoops of the barrel with an attention she usually reserved for sharpening blades. "You are careful with your hands," she said. "For a human. I have to be. A cask that leaks is a cask that ruins the salt inside it, and ruined salt does not feed anyone through the winter. Is that why you make them so well? For the winter?" "Partly." He had looked up at her then, and something in her face had been open in a way he had not seen before. Some guard let down that she usually kept raised as high as the camp's palisade. "Partly I just like doing something with my hands that lasts. Most of what I do out on that road, I sell it and it is gone. A good barrel outlives the man who made it. So do good blades," she said softly. "So do good names if a person is fortunate. Is that a compliment, Glasha Bloodhorn?" "It is an observation," she said, but she had not stepped back, and neither had he, and when he set the cask aside and reached up, half certain she would break his wrist for the presumption, to brush a strand of dark hair back from her face, she had simply let him, her breath catching audibly in the quiet tent. Then she had closed the last of the distance herself, seizing the front of his shirt the way she had that day over the pepper, and kissed him hard enough that he felt it in his teeth, one hand fisted in his collar and the other cradling the back of his skull, as though she were afraid he might try to escape. He had not tried to escape. He had kissed her back with everything he had, and when they finally broke apart, both of them breathing like they had run the length of the ridge, she had looked almost angry, though not at him. "This changes nothing about the price of pepper," she had warned him. "Wouldn't dream of asking," he had managed, and she had kissed him again just to prove she could. Winter came hard and early that year, and with it came the raid that broke Emberfall camp in half. Emmett had arrived 2 days before the first heavy snow, driving Biscuit and a second, borrowed mule loaded with the last of the season's salt stores, meaning to be back through the pass before the road closed. He had meant to leave that same evening. He had not left, because Glasha had asked him, in a rare unguarded moment by the cookfires, to stay just one more night and share the last of the harvest stew before the long white months shut the camp away from the rest of the world, and he had never once in his life managed to say no to her when she asked him for something with that particular softness in her voice. The attack came in the deep dark of that night, after the fires had burned low and most of the camp slept. There was no horn of warning, no scout's cry, only the sudden roar of flame catching against dry hide tents and the screaming of children startled from sleep. Men came through the gate in the confusion, wearing dark cloaks with no clan marks and no house colors, carrying torches and short swords, moving with the discipline of trained soldiers rather than the chaos of raiders, striking hardest and fastest at the Chieftess's own tent. Emmett had been asleep in the storage lodge when the first scream reached him, and he had come up off the furs with his coopering hatchet in his fist before his mind had finished catching up to his body. He remembered flame reflected off canvas walls, remembered the press of smoke thick enough to taste, remembered throwing himself bodily against a masked man who had cornered 2 orc children against the collapsed wall of a burning tent, swinging the hatchet not to kill, but to drive the man back long enough for the children to run. He remembered dragging an old woman clear of a falling support beam. He remembered, worst of all, the sound Glasha made when she found her mother. Glasha Bloodhorn had died defending the tent flap of her own lodge, cut down by 3 blades at once, and by the time the attackers melted back into the tree line as suddenly as they had come, half of Emberfall camp lay smoking in the snow, and the Chieftess of the Bloodhorn clan lay dead in her daughter's arms. Emmett had found Glasha kneeling in the ash and slush with her mother's blood soaking through the knees of her leathers, and he had not said a single word, because there were no words for that kind of grief, only knelt down beside her in the cold and put his arms around her shoulders and stayed there until the sky went gray with a dawn that felt like a mockery. The days that followed were hard ones, grief tangled up with fury and fury tangled up with fear, because no one, not the elders, not the surviving warriors, not Glasha herself in the depths of her sleepless nights, could say for certain who had sent the raiders, only that they had struck with a knowledge of the camp's layout too precise to be chance. And in that vacuum of answers, suspicion did what suspicion always does. It reached for the nearest stranger. "He was here," muttered Rucknar Stonewake at the funeral rites, not quite low enough that Emmett, standing at the edge of the mourning circle in his one clean shirt, could fail to hear it. "The one night he stayed past his usual leaving. The one night the raiders came. Tell me that is only chance, Glasha, and I will believe whatever you ask me to believe." "It is chance," Glasha said, her voice raw from 3 days of weeping and shouting in equal measure, "because I asked him to stay, old man, and if you want to blame someone for that, blame me." But the whispers did not stop entirely, not among the elders who had lost kin in the fire, and worse whispers traveled the other direction too. Word reached Windrow Hold within the week, carried by frightened traders who had passed close enough to see the smoke, that the orc camp beyond Cinder Ridge had been attacked and burned, and that a Windrow man, a cooper's son who had been trading with the Greenskins for years, had been present in their camp on the very night it happened. It did not take much imagination for certain men in Windrow Hold, men who stood to profit from war rather than trade, to turn that single fact into a story about a traitor who had guided the attackers in, or perhaps guided the orcs' vengeance out, depending on which version served their purposes better that particular week. Reeve Corwin Thale, who governed Windrow Hold in the name of a distant baron who rarely visited, was exactly the sort of man who understood how useful a good story could be. Glasha understood, faster than her grieving elders did, exactly how much danger Emmett stood in from both directions at once, suspected by her own people for a crime he had risked his life trying to stop, and about to be devoured by his own for the crime of having survived among orcs at all. She called the clan together on the 5th night after the burning, beneath a sky finally clear of smoke, and she did the one thing she knew would silence every doubting tongue in Emberfall camp at once, even as it would set the whole borderland alight with a different kind of fire. She claimed him. It was an old rite, older than the current Chieftess line, one Glasha had heard described only in the stories her grandmother used to tell of harder centuries, when clans bound outsiders to themselves not through vows spoken but through blood shared, a mark cut into each palm and pressed together before witnesses, declaring that whatever befell one from that moment forward befell them both, that an insult to the claimed was an insult to the clan itself. She stood Emmett before the assembled Bloodhorn people, still hollow-eyed with grief but standing straight as a spear, and she did not ask him first, because orc custom did not ask, it declared, and a part of her that she would only later admit to him was terrified he might refuse her in front of everyone and leave her exposed as a fool as well as an orphan. "This man fought beside us the night we burned," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the gathered crowd. "He bled defending children who were not his own, in a camp that was not his own, among a people not his own. I will not have him named a traitor by the fireside talk of old men too frightened to remember what they saw with their own eyes. I claim him. From this hour, Emmett Holloway is bound to the Bloodhorn line, and any hand raised against him is raised against me." Emmett's heart had been hammering hard enough that he was certain the whole camp could hear it, but when she turned to him, blade already drawn, palm already offered, he had not hesitated. He held out his own hand and let her cut a shallow line across it, felt the answering sting as she pressed her palm to his, and held it there, blood mingling, her amber eyes locked on his with a ferocity that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with a promise neither of them had put into ordinary words yet. "I do not know your customs well enough to know what I am agreeing to," he had murmured, only for her. "You are agreeing to be mine," she murmured back, "whether you understood the ceremony or not. It is a little late to negotiate, Cooper." "I was never much good at negotiating with you anyway," he said, and something in her face had softened even as the crowd around them erupted into the low, rumbling chant that marked the rite complete. It should have ended the whispers in Emberfall camp, and it did. It also, within the space of 2 weeks, reached Windrow Hold in a form twisted almost beyond recognition, carried by the same frightened traders and sharpened by the same ambitious reeve. The cooper's son had bound himself in blood to the orc chieftess's own daughter, had sworn himself to the clan that had, by every account reaching town, just been struck by a raiding party that some now whispered had been human after all, sent to punish the orcs for some offense no one could quite name. It was a small step from there to the story Thale wanted told, the one where Emmett Holloway had not merely traded with the enemy but had betrayed his own people to them, had perhaps even guided the burning of Imberfall Camp himself, before turning his loyalties fully to the orcs who had, conveniently for the story, chosen that exact moment to claim him as one of their own. Emmett did not learn how bad it had become until he rode back into Windrow Hold 2 weeks later to settle his father's accounts and collect a fresh load of salt, and found the town square already crowded and a gallows already built. They took him before he had even dismounted, 4 of Thale's garrison men closing around him with pikes lowered, and dragged him through streets he had walked his whole life, while neighbors he had known since boyhood stared at him with faces gone hard and frightened, the particular fear of people who have been told a story simple enough to believe without asking questions. Reeve Thale himself stood on the raised steps of the town hall to deliver the charge, a lean, silver-templed man with the kind of composed, reasonable voice that made accusations sound like simple fact. "Emmett Holloway, Cooper's son of this town," Thale announced to the gathered crowd, "stands accused of treason against the crown and the free people of Windrow Hold, for consorting with the orc raiders who burned their own camp to stir war upon this border, for binding himself by blood to their chieftain's line, and for concealing knowledge of an attack that has since claimed innocent lives on both sides of the ridge. The penalty for treason of this kind is death by hanging, to be carried out at dawn." There had been no trial worth the name. Only a hurried, one-sided hearing conducted the following gray morning in the same square where the gallows stood waiting, witnesses hand-picked by Thale's own men, repeating rehearsed fears about orc raiders and burning camps, no one asking the one question that might have unraveled the whole lie, which was how a lone salt trader could possibly have coordinated an attack against the very camp he had been sleeping inside of when it happened. Fear, once lit, does not ask questions. It only wants somewhere to burn, and Emmett Holloway, standing in the square with his wrists bound, and his father's old cooper's apron still folded uselessly in his abandoned cart, was exactly the kindling Thale needed. They walked him up the gallows steps as the first gray light broke over the eastern hills. A small crowd of frightened, murmuring townsfolk gathered below, some with faces turned away, unable to watch, some leaning forward hungrily the way crowds sometimes do when fear curdles into something uglier. The noose settled cold and rough around his neck. He looked out over the square, over the rooftops of the only town he had ever called home, and thought, with a strange and terrible calm, of a gate warden with twin braids and a spear planted in the dirt, and hoped that wherever she was not watching this. She was not watching. She was already 3 hours into a hard ride down the cinder road with 40 of her clan's fastest riders behind her, because word of his arrest had reached Imberfall Camp the previous evening, carried by a frightened traitor who owed Emmett a debt of kindness, and repaid it the only way he could, by riding through the night to warn the one person who might still be able to stop what was coming. Reeve Thale had just raised his hand to signal the executioner toward the lever when the first horn note cut across the square, low and long and utterly unmistakable to anyone who had ever heard an orc war horn sounded in earnest. The crowd turned as one. Over the low rise at the northern edge of town, cresting the road at a dead gallop with her braids streaming and her twin blades already drawn, came Glasha Bloodhorn, and behind her the thunder of 40 riders shook dust from every rooftop in Windrow Hold. "Cut him down!" she roared, a sound that carried across the whole square and silenced even Thal's own soldiers where they stood frozen at their posts. "Cut him down, or I will paint this square with every man who so much as touches that lever." The executioner, a garrison soldier who had signed up to keep peace in a quiet border town, and never once imagined he would be asked to hang a man in front of an approaching orc warband, made the entirely reasonable choice to step back from the lever with both hands raised. It was not fast enough for Glasha's liking. She did not slow her horse at the edge of the square, did not wait for the crowd to part, simply drove the animal straight through the scattering onlookers and up the wooden steps of the gallows platform itself, the boards groaning under the horse's weight, and in the same motion swung one blade in a flat, precise arc that severed the rope a hand's width above the fraying knot at Emmett's throat. He dropped. She caught him, one arm hooking around his ribs even as she stayed mounted, hauling him bodily up against her side with a strength that should have been impossible and somehow was not. And for one breathless moment, the whole town square stared up at the sight of an orc chieftain's daughter holding a half-hanged human traitor against her hip on the back of a warhorse atop a gallows platform, both of them staring at each other as though the rest of the world had simply ceased to exist. "You are late," Emmett managed, his voice a raw croak, and could not quite believe he had found it in himself to make the joke. "I am never late," Glasha said fiercely, though her hands were shaking as she worked the noose the rest of the way off his throat. "I'm exactly on time. Everyone else is simply too slow." Reeve had gone the color of old ash, backing toward the town hall steps with his soldiers forming an uncertain half-circle, unsure whether to raise their pikes against 40 mounted riders or lower them and pray for mercy. Glasha swung down from the horse, setting Emmett's feet on solid ground and keeping one arm braced around him even as she turned the full weight of her fury on the reeve. "You would have hanged an innocent man on a lie you built yourself," she said. Her voice did not shout now. It did not need to. It carried anyway, hard and clear across the stunned silence of the square. "I know who sent the raiders to Emberfall camp, Reeve Thale. I have had a season to learn it, and I did not ride here only to save one man's neck. I rode here to finish what your soldiers started. You have no proof of any such." "I have this," Glasha said, and from inside her jerkin she drew out a scrap of dark cloth, a tabard torn from a dead raider's shoulder during the attack, its edge stitched with a small, distinctive mark, a mark that matched precisely the seal ring still visible on Thal's own right hand, the ring he had likely forgotten he was wearing when his men rode out that night to burn a camp and blame it on chaos. "One of the men who murdered my mother wore your household's mark stitched into his collar, Reeve. He died in the fire he set. I kept this scrap for a season, waiting to see whether you would be fool enough to hang the one man who could have told this whole town the truth before I had the chance to bring it myself." A murmur went through the crowd, sharper now, edged with something that had not been there before. Captain Aldous Rain, the garrison officer who had stood silent through the whole proceeding with visible discomfort etched into every line of his face, stepped forward from among Thal's own soldiers to take the scrap of cloth from Glasha's hand and turn it over, comparing the stitched mark against the Reeve's ring with the slow, careful attention of a man who had clearly harbored his own doubts for longer than he had dared admit. "This is the household mark," Rain said quietly, and then louder so the whole square could hear it. "This is the Thale household mark, stitched into a raider's collar." "It is a fabrication," Thale snapped, though the color had entirely drained from his face now, "planted by orc sympathizers too. I did not plant it in a dead man's own tent," Glasha said. "I did not plant the taxes you have been quietly redirecting from the Cinder Road trade for 2 years, taxes that would have flowed twice as heavy if the orc clans who share that road were driven off it or burned out entirely. Ask your own captain how much coin has vanished from the toll house ledgers since the thaw before last. I did not need to invent a reason for you to want my clan gone from that mountain, Reeve Thale. Greed invented it for you. It took only that much in the end, a torn scrap of cloth, and a season's worth of quiet ledger discrepancies that Captain Rain, once given leave to speak freely, was suddenly and vocally eager to confirm, for the crowd of Windrow hold to turn, and turn hard, against the man who had nearly hanged one of their own on a lie built to hide his own crimes. Thale did not even manage a full sentence of protest before Rain's soldiers, no longer his to command in any sense that mattered, took hold of his arms and walked him, not toward the gallows that still stood with its severed rope swaying gently in the morning wind, but toward the same cells he had meant for Emmett, to await a trial that would, this time, actually deserve the name. Emmett stood in the middle of the square with his wrists still raw from the bindings and his throat still burning from the rope, and looked up at the woman who had ridden 3 hard hours through the night and cut him down with a single perfect stroke of a blade, and found he did not have a single clever thing left to say. "You came," he said instead, simply. "Did you think I would not?" Glasha's voice cracked on the question, all the fury of the last few minutes suddenly draining out of her at once, leaving something rower and more frightened underneath it. "I have already buried my mother this year, Emmett Holloway. I was not going to bury you as well while there was still breath in me to stop it." He reached up, ignoring the pain in his shoulders, and cupped her face in both hands, and she let him, right there in the middle of the square in front of 40 mounted riders and half the population of Windrow Hold, let him pull her down until their foreheads touched, and she could feel him shaking as badly as she was. "I love you," he said, low enough that it was almost only for her, though he suspected half the square heard it anyway and did not care in the least. "I do not know when it happened, somewhere between the pepper and the burning and the blood on our hands that first night. I love you, and I am sorry it took a rope around my neck for me to finally say it plainly. I claimed you before I ever gave you the chance to court me properly," Glasha said, half a laugh and half a sob tangled together in her throat. "I did the whole thing backward. I bound you to me before I ever let myself say what I felt because I was too frightened of losing you to wait for it to be earned honestly. Then let us earn it now," he said, "properly. In whatever order the ancestors will forgive us for." She kissed him then, in front of the whole square, in front of soldiers and townsfolk and her own riders, kissed him slow and fierce and entirely unhurried, as though daring anyone in that crowd to still believe the lie they had been fed about a traitor and an orc invasion. And when they finally broke apart there was, remarkably, a low, ragged cheer rising from somewhere in the crowd, and then another, until even some of the garrison soldiers who had stood ready to hang him an hour before were pounding their pike butts against the cobbles in a rough approximation of applause. The weeks that followed were not simple ones. Peace between a border town and a mountain clan does not mend overnight merely because one corrupt reeve has been dragged off in chains, and there were councils and hard conversations, and no small amount of lingering suspicion to work through on both sides of Cinder Ridge. But Captain Rain, installed as acting reeve until the Baron could send a proper replacement, proved a fairer hand than his predecessor, and Glasha herself, though grieving still, threw herself into the work of rebuilding trust with a determination that left Emmett half in awe of her even as she exhausted every elder who tried to argue with her. He stayed close through it all, not merely because the claiming bound him to her clan now in the eyes of every orc in Imberfall camp, but because he could not have made himself leave her side even if the old rite had never been spoken over their joined hands. He helped rebuild the storage lodges through the last hard weeks of winter, his hands finding the familiar comfort of wood and hoop iron even as his heart found a home he had never quite let himself imagine in all his years walking the cinder road alone. In the evenings, when the work was done and the fires burned low, Glasha would find him in the same storage tent where she had first kissed him, and there was no more pretense between them of arguing over pepper prices to excuse the closeness, only the quiet, unhurried warmth of two people who had already survived the worst that fear and grief and a hangman's rope could throw at them, and had chosen, deliberately and with open eyes, to build something steady on the other side of it. She would come to him in the low lamplight and simply set her forehead against his shoulder sometimes, saying nothing at all. And he had learned by then not to fill that silence with words, only to wrap his arms around her and let her breathe until whatever storm of memory had passed through her had quieted. Other nights, she would be the one to pull him close first, hungry and certain, her hands finding the laces of his shirt with the same deliberate focus she brought to sharpening a blade, and he would lose himself gladly in the warmth of her, in the low sound she made against his mouth, in the astonishing, humbling fact of being wanted so completely by a woman who could have had the loyalty and desire of any warrior in the camp, and had chosen, again and again, to want only him. "I keep waiting for you to grow tired of me," he admitted once, in the deep hush after, her arms slung heavy and possessive across his chest, her breath warm against his throat. "Then you will wait a very long time," she murmured, "because it is not going to happen, Cooper. I have buried a mother and nearly buried you in the same season. I am done wasting time being uncertain about the things I already know." Spring came late that year, but it came, and with it came the formal gathering of the clan elders to confirm, at last, what every warrior in Imberfall camp already understood to be true, that Vashka's daughter would take up the chieftain's mantle. There was, briefly, a challenge to that succession, as there sometimes was among the Bloodhorn when a chieftain died in violence rather than old age. A broad-shouldered warrior named Gorn Ironjaw stood before the gathered clan and argued that a chieftess who had bound herself to a human traitor could not be trusted to lead a clan through a war footing if war ever came again, that her judgment was compromised by a heart too soft for the mountains. Glasha had answered him not with words but with a challenge blade, meeting him in the packed snow of the training yard before the whole assembled camp, and had put him on his back inside 3 exchanges, her knee planted against his throat, and her own knife resting light against his collarbone. "My heart," she told him, breathing hard but entirely unhurried, "did not stop me from riding into Windrow Hold alone against 40 soldiers to save the man I love. Tell me again how soft you think it is, Gorn Ironjaw, or tell me you yield." He yielded. No one else stepped forward to contest her after that. Which brought the whole camp at last to the night of the coronation feast, to the crown resting untouched on its cushion, and to a chieftess-elect standing over an empty chair carved with a cooper's mark, refusing to sit until it was filled. Emmett, in fact, was not far away at all. He had ridden that very morning to the border, not to Windrow Hold itself, but to the boundary stone at the edge of the cinder road. To complete the last piece of a gift he had spent the whole of the past month coopering in secret between the rebuilding work, staying up long after Glasha had fallen asleep to shape and hoop, and burn the design into the wood by lamplight. It was a ceremonial cask, small enough to be carried in 2 hands, bound in iron hoops he had forged himself, and etched along the staves with the interlocking marks of both the Bloodhorn clan crest and the Cooper's Guild seal of Windrow Hold, filled with the first salt harvest of the new season from both sides of the ridge, mixed together in one vessel, as a symbol he hoped she would understand without him needing to explain it aloud. He had meant to be back well before sundown. A late spring storm over Cinder Ridge had other ideas, delaying him just long enough that, when the riders Glasha sent finally found him, he was still a full hour's hard ride from Imberfall camp, soaked to the skin and cursing the mountain weather with every mile. He came through the camp gate at a dead run on a borrowed horse, the small cask lashed tight against his chest inside his cloak, mud-splattered and breathless, and the gate wardens, who by now knew exactly what tonight meant and exactly whose empty chair the whole clan was waiting on, threw the gate wide and let him through without a single question. Inside the great lodge, the assembled clan and the human envoys from Windrow Hold had settled into a restless, murmuring quiet, the food going cold on the tables, the crown still resting untouched on its cushion, Glasha standing at the head of the hall with her arms crossed, and her jaw set in the particular stubborn line that every warrior present had learned over the past season, meant there was no earthly power that would move her from her chosen course. Ragnar Stonewake had long since stopped arguing and simply stood beside her, watching the door with as much tension as she did, because, whatever his early doubts about the human Cooper had been, he had come to understand well enough by now what this night meant to his chieftess, and what it would cost her to be denied it. The hide flap at the far end of the lodge was thrown back, and the cold spring wind that swept in with it carried the smell of wet earth and horse, and unmistakably, Emmett Holloway, standing in the threshold soaked through and out of breath, with a small iron-bound cask held against his chest like something more precious than gold. The whole hall turned as one, and Glasha's breath left her in a rush that had nothing to do with relief alone. "You are late," she said, though her voice shook on it, betraying every ounce of the fear she had refused to show the whole long evening. "I am exactly on time," Emmett said, echoing her own words back to her from the gallows steps with a small, exhausted smile, and crossed the length of the hall to stand before her, setting the cask down on the head table with careful hands. "I would not have missed this for anything short of the mountain falling on me, Glasha, and even then I think I would have found a way to crawl the rest of the distance. What is this?" she asked, though her fingers were already tracing the etched marks along the staves, the interlocking crests, the two salts mingled into one vessel. "A gift," he said, "for the woman who claimed me in blood before she ever let herself say she loved me, and who taught me that a good barrel outlives the man who made it, but a good bond outlives the barrel too, if you build it strong enough. It is the salt of your mountain and the salt of my valley, mixed together in one cask, because I do not think either of us belongs entirely to one side of that ridge anymore. I think we belong to each other, and wherever that leads us, it should be together." The hall had gone utterly silent, every elder and every warrior and every human envoy watching as Glasha Bloodhorn, chieftess-elect of the Bloodhorn clan, reached up with both hands to grip the front of Emmett Holloway's soaked shirt, exactly the way she had the very first season they had argued over the price of pepper, and pulled him down to meet her at the threshold of the lodge doorway, right where the cold night air still spilled in around them both. "I refused this crown for you," she said, low enough now that it was almost only for him, though every soul in that hall leaned forward to hear it anyway. "I will not take up a chieftain's mantle over an empty chair when the man I love is somewhere out on that mountain in a storm. I told them there would be no coronation and no feast until you sat beside me, and I meant every word of it, Emmett Holloway." "Then let me make you a vow instead, right here," Emmett said, "over this threshold in front of your whole clan, so there is no doubt left in anyone's mind, orc or human, about where I stand. I vow to you that I will keep the seat beside you filled for as long as I have breath in my body. I vow to stand at your side through every winter and every raid and every hard council still to come, not because a blood right bound me to you, but because I choose you freely again, right now, with my whole heart, exactly the way you chose to ride through 40 soldiers to cut a rope from around my neck. I love you, Glasha Bloodhorn, and I am not going anywhere ever again, unless you are standing right beside me when I go." She did not answer him with words. She answered him by hauling him the rest of the way across the threshold, and kissing him hard and fierce and unhurried in front of the whole assembled clan, in front of Ragnar Stonewake wiping suspicious moisture from the corner of one eye, in front of Windrow Hold envoys who would carry this story back down the Cinder Road and tell it in taverns for years to come, in front of every warrior who had once doubted whether a human traitor could ever truly belong among them, and now watched their chieftess kiss him like the answer to a question none of them would ever think to ask again. When she finally let him go, breathless and laughing in a way the whole camp had rarely seen from her, she turned him by the shoulder and walked him the last few steps to the head table herself, and pulled out the low oak chair carved with the cooper's mark, the leather apron still folded neatly across its seat, and set it beside her own. "Sit, Cooper," she said, and her voice, for the first time all night, was steady and warm and entirely certain. "The seat has been waiting for you, so have I." He sat. The apron he set carefully across his knee, an old habit, and the whole hall let out a breath it seemed to have been holding for hours. Warriors reaching for their cups, elders nodding to one another with expressions ranging from relief to something almost like affection. The human envoys from Windrow Hold, to their own visible surprise, applauding along with the rest. Only then did Glasha Bloodhorn turn back to the cushion where the crown still waited, a simple iron and horn circlet worn by every Bloodhorn chieftain before her, and lifted at last into both hands. "I did not delay this crown out of disrespect for my mother's memory," she said to the hall, her voice carrying clear and strong now that the fear had finally left it. "I delayed it because she taught me, without ever meaning to, that a chieftain's first duty is to the people she loves, and I would not have been fit to wear her crown tonight if I had let fear of scandal or tradition keep me from filling that chair with the one person who has earned his place in it 100 times over. Let it be known from this night forward, by anyone who doubts it, that the Bloodhorn clan does not turn its back on those who bleed for it, whether they are born to these mountains or walked here one salt barrel at a time." She set the crown upon her own head then, and the hall rose as one in a roar of approval that shook the new-built beams of the lodge, warriors striking their cups against the tables, elders bowing their heads in old formal reverence, and beneath all of it, unnoticed by no one, Emmett Holloway reached across the space between their two chairs and found Glasha's hand, and she laced her fingers through his and held on tight in front of her whole clan, in front of the crown she had just claimed. Exactly as though she never intended to let go again. The feast began at last, food passed and cups filled and old grief set aside, at least for one night, in favor of celebration long overdue. Somewhere in the noise and warmth of it, Ruknar Stonewake leaned across the table to clasp Emmett's forearm in the rough grip orcs used among their own kin, a gesture Emmett had watched 100 times among warriors and never once thought to receive himself. "You are a strange sort of Cooper," the old elder said, "but I think in the end you may be a strong name after all. The mountains did not eat you. Perhaps that is worth something." "Perhaps it is," Emmett agreed, glancing sideways at Glasha, who was watching the exchange with a faint, satisfied smile over the rim of her cup, the firelight catching the iron rings threaded through her braids and the new crown resting easy on her brow as though it had always belonged there. "I intend to keep proving it, for as long as she will let me stay." "She will let you stay," Ruknar said, with the particular dry certainty of a man who had watched his chieftess move mountains for exactly one human traitor over the course of a single hard season. "I do not think there is a force in this world that could move that woman off her course once she has decided what she wants. You would know that better than anyone, Cooper." Later, long after the feast had wound down into low fireside talk, and the last of the human envoys had retired to the guest tents set aside for them, Glasha drew Emmett out of the lodge and up along the camp's rebuilt palisade wall, to the same stretch of watchtower where she had once stood guard with a spear planted in the dirt and dared a stranger to prove himself worth remembering. The night was clear now, the storm long past, stars scattered thick and bright over the black shoulders of Cinder Ridge, the lights of Windrow Hold glimmering faint and distant far down the valley below. "Do you regret any of it?" she asked him quietly, leaning into the solid warmth of his side as his arm came around her without hesitation, the crown still resting on her brow, the two of them alone at last with the whole night spread out below them. "The claiming before the courting, the rope around your throat, the whole backward, dangerous shape of how we came to this." "Not for one single moment," Emmett said, and meant it down to the bones. "I have spent my whole life on that road down there, walking between two worlds that barely trusted each other, never quite belonging fully to either one. I did not know, until you put a spear in my path and a blade to my palm, what it might feel like to belong somewhere completely. You gave me that, Glasha, backward order and blood right and gallows rope and all of it. I would walk through every part of it again if it led back here, to this wall with you." She turned in the circle of his arm, tilting her face up to his beneath the crown that marked her, at last, the undisputed chieftess of the Bloodhorn clan, and there was no rivalry left in her eyes now, no test to pass, only a warmth so open and unguarded that it took his breath away every time he was fortunate enough to see it. "Then let us make it official one final time," she said. "Not by blood this time, but by choice, freely given, the way you promised me at the threshold tonight. Marry me properly, Emmett Holloway, under whatever rights your own people keep, so that no one on either side of this ridge, human or orc, can ever again mistake what we are to each other." "I already promised you everything I have to give," he said, "at that threshold in front of your whole clan. But if you want the word said again, under whatever sky and whatever right either of our people can dream up, then yes. Yes, 1,000 times, for as long as you will keep asking me." She kissed him then, slow and certain, with the crown of a chieftess resting against his brow and the whole quiet, healing borderland spread out beneath them, no longer smoldering, no longer torn between two peoples who had spent too long mistaking fear for wisdom, but settling at last into something steadier, something built the way Emmett Holloway built his barrels, plank by careful plank, hoop by hoop, strong enough to outlast the both of them and warm enough in that moment to hold every promise either of them would ever need to keep. They were married within the month, in a ceremony that blended both their people's customs so thoroughly that neither the orc elders nor the Windrow hold envoys who attended could quite agree afterward which parts had been whose tradition, and which had simply been invented on the spot by two people determined to build something entirely their own. Emmett wore, at Glasha's insistence, his father's old cooper's apron over his wedding clothes, a small joke between them that only the two of them fully understood, and Glasha wore her fitted battle leathers beneath a ceremonial fur mantle. The clan women had spent a full week stitching in secret, refusing, even for her own wedding, to trade the armor that had carried her through the worst season of her life for anything softer. When the final vow was spoken, standing once more at a threshold, this time the newly carved doorway of the chieftain's own rebuilt lodge, Glasha took Emmett's face in both her hands the way she had that very first night in the storage tent, and kissed him in front of the assembled crowd of clan and townsfolk both, and the cheer that rose up around them shook the mountain itself, echoing down the cinder road toward a valley finally, fully at peace, all the way to a chair that would never again sit empty.